The Senate continues to debate the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. We just had a vote on the Senate floor on cloture. An effort was made to cut off debate and go to a vote on final passage of this resolution. 60 votes are required to cut off debate. We got 57. So on that note, we will begin our news conference. Let me just say that I do hope we can bring debate on this issue to a close very soon. Obviously, it will not occur this week. That's doubtful. Maybe next week. In any event, this is an issue that has been debated for a long time. Senators have had an opportunity to consider arguments pro and con. It's time for us to take action. The country is going in a direction that's going to lead us into fiscal nightmares, a crisis, possible bankruptcy, and we've got to develop new procedures, new restraints in order to do a better job of controlling the growing federal debt. I'm hoping that the fact that the President's budget that was just submitted to Congress illustrates how important it is that we take early action on this. 16% of our total federal budget this year is going to be devoted to paying interest on the national debt. $257 billion will be the interest payment next fiscal year on the accumulated debt. And an additional $200 billion in debt is projected to be accumulated next year under the President's budget request. This is intolerable. We've got to act. This constitutional amendment is a step toward more fiscal restraint, more incentive to do something effective about controlling the deficit. And I'm for it. I'm going to vote for it, and I think we're going to win if we keep plugging along and pushing hard, and those people out there calling on their senators to support this amendment. I'll be glad to talk about that or any other issues that you would like to question me about. First, let me call on Kip Smith.
Yes, sir. How you doing?
Fine.
Recently, the crime bill that was passed would have put money directly in the hands of law enforcement people around the nation. Now, there's been mention of changing it back to the block grant type of programs. Would you think that would dilute the crime bill's purpose, dilute the fact that this money would be going directly to law enforcement, and now you're putting it in the hands of people who may not, there's a chance they may not put it directly to that means? Is that a problem upcoming?
I think the issue is whether we want the local officials to decide how the money is to be spent battling crime, or whether people in Washington think that they have the best idea and they decide. Frankly, I think it's better to let local officials have more flexibility, and that's what the debate's all about. Here at the federal level, the President devised a program that provides some money to some towns and cities to help hire new policemen. But the federal government pays only part of the cost. It phases out of the program completely after 4 years. And the issue is whether we would rather use that money, give it to state governments or give it to other state agencies or local agencies to fight crime in the way they think is best for their local community. That's the question.
Thank you, sir.
Dave Laval.
Good morning, Senator. This morning in North Alabama had a deadly tornado, or tornadoes rather, 5 killed, over 50 injured. I'm watching C-SPAN 2 right now in the Senate, and they're talking about exempting federal disaster from the balanced budget amendment as well as Social Security. Do you support both those measures?
I think what we need to do is to deal with issues like that in the implementing legislation. What this amendment is simply a framework requiring Congress to have as its policy operation every year within a budget that is balanced. Do not project to spend more than you take in any given year, as a general rule. And that's all the constitutional amendment is. The details of how you implement that, how you enforce that, the procedures that are followed each year by Congress, the deadlines that have to be met, and all the rest are left to the implementing legislation. Many Democrats are saying we've got to do it all in this one resolution. Well, that's just not possible. We don't want all that in the U.S. Constitution. Look at the Constitution. Look at the other amendments. They're one sentence or 2 sentences. You don't have this long, involved minutiae of details that are the content of many of these amendments that some of the Democrats are suggesting we ought to put into the Constitution. Well, that's absurd. Of course we want to take Social Security off the table. Of course we're going to provide disaster assistance when that is needed. But within the broad framework of the constitutional commitment to operating each year on a balanced budget. That's what this amendment says. That's all it should say.
All right. right, sir. Thank you.
Jeff Rand in Greenville.
Yes, Senator. Going back to the crime package, the Republican crime package, and talking about the block grant and giving that money to officials, there is the problem here in the Delta that a lot of towns of small population, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people, only have one officer for that whole town. And I think the biggest fear now is how that's going to affect them being able to get more officers on the streets to help control the crime, which they do have a problem.
Well, let me say, Jeff, that this bill does not provide much money to the Mississippi Delta to hire policemen. I think 1 or 2 towns may qualify. That's it. And they qualify for only part of the cost. So the promise out there is to put police on the streets. The president makes it sound like every community is going to lose policemen if this crime bill is somehow changed or modified. That's just bunk. There are very few towns in our state that have been given grants to start with. Most towns didn't even apply for the money. 90% of the towns in Mississippi, I would guess, and I wish I knew this for a fact, I would guess 90% did not even submit an application to be approved because they couldn't afford the additional matching costs, they couldn't afford the health insurance, the training costs, the equipment that would go along with hiring new policemen. So while the president promises that this bill does a lot of things, or that his crime bill does a lot of things, it's not altogether true. And so I would hope that the people would look behind the rhetoric at the facts. And the facts are that the federal government needs to support local law enforcement efforts. We need to do a better job of helping do the things that the local governments can't do, providing technical assistance, information about dangerous criminals that are in the area. If you apprehend somebody, being able to punch in a number in Washington and find out what the criminal record of this person is, so you'll have some idea of whether you have somebody on your hands who's a fugitive from justice. These are the kinds of things the federal government can do that the state and local governments can't do. So we need to have a division of responsibility and a better degree of understanding on what the federal government's role is. We can do a better job than that recently passed crime bill.
Okay, thank you, sir.
John Turner in Columbus.
Yes, sir, Senator. Yesterday, Senator Lugar said he wants to cut federal spending on farm programs by, I believe it was up to 30% over the next 5 years, especially subsidies. Was wondering what your opinion was on that and how you see that affecting us here at home.
Well, one thing about the Lugar proposal is that it requests only a 3% reduction in income support programs over a 5-year period. That's a small part of the recommendation he's making. Some of the other changes that he is suggesting are in market promotion programs or export enhancement programs, things that may be outdated because of the new trade agreements we have, which abolish trade barriers, which try to make the international marketplace free and fair to U.S. exporters and farmers. And so we may not need these programs that were historically used to deal with unfair trade practice, or we may not need as much money as we're devoted to it. So a total of $11 billion out of a $40+ billion agriculture budget for income support and other things is the recommendation of Senator Lugar. I think that's probably a little too much myself. I think that we need to recognize that agriculture's already taken a lot of cuts in order to achieve compliance with GATT. We've already reduced subsidies by 20% since the baseline year of 1986. That's a substantial reduction. If all the other programs of the government had already been reduced by the amount agriculture has already been reduced, we'd have a balanced budget. But many other federal programs are growing at a much more rapid rate than agriculture. Agriculture costs are actually coming down. So I think we need to keep that in mind. I've written a letter that actually disagrees with Senator Lugar's proposal in some respects to the chairman of the Budget Committee. 9 other senators have joined me in signing that letter. And so I'm going to make sure that the interests of our farmers are taken into account very carefully by the Budget Committee in its deliberations on the budget resolution.
Thank you, Senator.
Brett Austin in Biloxi.
Yes, Senator. Do you foresee the Senate making any changes to the crime bill passed in the House to make it a little more appealing to the president so he won't have to veto it?
Well, that's a good point. You know, when we get to this point in the legislative process, we have to recognize that to enact something, we've got to get the president to sign it. And so rather than pass 5 bills on the subject of criminal law reform as they've done in the House, the Senate will probably pass only 1 bill. We will take all of the suggestions the House has made, consider them fairly and fully, and probably report out a single bill here in the Senate. And we have to negotiate with the President. There's no question about that. If we're unsuccessful, then I say let's pass the bill we'd like to see. And if the President wants to veto it and can sustain that veto, well, we'll have to respect the decision that he's made and that those have made in Congress to sustain his veto, and then we'll go back to the drawing boards and try to work out something that can be signed. That's the process, and that's the way it's going to have to work as we try to achieve our goal of combating crime more effectively. We don't think the President's bill is very effective in dealing with the real problems of violence in America, and we need to do a better job of dealing with that, and we think we can with better legislation.
Yes, and follow up, the debate over the Surgeon General nominee, Foster, do you see this as a debate over White House credibility or a debate over abortion?
Well, the White House would like to have it as a debate on abortion rights. Those of us in the Senate who are going to have to vote on the confirmation, if it's not withdrawn, see it as an issue of credibility. And we will have an opportunity to ask questions and find out what the facts really are. I don't think we should base a decision right now, and we won't get to anyway, on just the press statements, the conflicting stories that have come from both the nominee and the White House and others on these subjects. We need to look into his qualifications, his fitness for this job, in the atmosphere of a hearing that probes and finds out what the facts really are, all of the facts that are relevant to this issue, and then we'll make a decision. We'll see who's right. Steve Williams in Hattiesburg.
Good morning, Senator. On the balanced budget amendment, as you know, there's been some concern expressed from some quarters that a balanced budget amendment might upset the balance of powers in the Constitution, that if you write budget policy into the Constitution, you might ultimately open the door to give the courts or even the President, ultimate power over the nation's purse. How would you allay those fears?
Steve, those are very legitimate concerns, and I share them. It is a question of balancing, though, those concerns with the reality of our experience in dealing with the continuing problem of accumulating debt. The federal government has accumulated debt to the extent that it's one of the biggest items in our budget now, just the interest on the accumulated debt. We're going to spend almost as much money this year paying interest on the debt as we are for national defense. Think about that. We're going to spend $262 billion under the President's budget for national defense and $257 billion for interest on the accumulated debt. And when you have a $1.6 trillion budget, that rounds out to about the same percentage, even though defense is a few $billion more than interest payments. We've got to change that. And the President's budget doesn't suggest any new deficit fighting steps to take. It projects a higher deficit for next year than we've got this year. So we've got to do something. We can't just continue down this path toward economic crisis and bankruptcy for the nation. It's an irresponsible act for this Congress not to proceed in the direction that this balanced budget amendment suggests, and that is simply that an extraordinary majority of members of Congress are required in order to operate at a deficit in any given fiscal year, beginning in the year 2002. It doesn't require, by constitutional law, the budget be balanced, simply that there be a larger majority than is normally required to approve a budget that's out of balance. So it's being over-advertised by those who oppose it and used as a way of frightening folks into voting against it or having doubts about it. But your concerns are legitimate. They're my concerns too. We're going to have to monitor the operation of our budget process very carefully in the future under this amendment if it is adopted and ratified by the states. So it's a long way from being adopted, and we'll have implementing legislation to sort out the balance of power. We'll have opportunities to debate these processes much further and in more detail later on. But the question now is, do we need a national policy to have a balanced federal budget every year? And my answer is yes. It's overdue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, we've used a little bit more than our 15 minutes that they've allotted us. Let me thank you all for joining us on our Washington News Conference. Have a good weekend.
You too, sir.
Thanks, Senator.